The Las Vegas Raiders have officially made a change at the offensive coordinator position, and they have fired offensive coach Luke Getsy. And this is phenomenal news, man. I don't know what else to tell you guys, but I'm happy that the Las Vegas Raiders have officially made the change, and they have moved off of Luke Getsy, because I think this was one of those things that really has held the Raiders back up to this point. You know, when you think about the Raiders season so far, I think that there's one thing that's really kept this team back, and I really do think Luke Getsy is the biggest issue right now for the Raiders. And I think Antonio Pierce should have made the change weeks back, but I understand why you can't make that change so early. You know, in the NFL, you got to think of in terms of 17 full games. You can't take it week by week because, you know, if you make a change after 3 weeks, week 4, you might regret that change, and you still have 13, 14 more games remaining. I understand why you want to give Luke Getsy 8 to 9 games, but you realize this guy's not a good offensive coordinator, and the Raiders have made that change. And I'm happy to hear that they have ultimately fired Luke Getsy. The Raiders are expected to go forward with Scott Turner as their offensive coordinator, although it's not 100% confirmed. Scott Turner right now with the Raiders is our pass game coordinator. So we'll see what he can kind of do. You know, he's had some success over the past couple of years. He called plays for the Washington Commanders last year. Sam Howell's the guy that's kind of had some success with Scott Turner calling the plays. We'll see what ends up happening. You know, I do think that the Raiders, you know, this season's probably over at this point, but I do think you can still find success in this season. You know, you can find out if Gardner Minshew has any sort of upside. And I'm not talking about long-term, this guy's your starting quarterback, but I'm talking about, you know, there might only be one first-round quarterback in this upcoming class, and even then, there might not be any quarterbacks in this class that are potential starting quarterbacks in the NFL. Right? If there's one thing we've kind of seen happen over the past couple of years, you know, you look at Anthony Richardson, you look at Bryce Young, you look at Kenny Pickett, and you look at Justin Fields, and, you know, even going beyond that, you know, you look at all these quarterbacks, Trey Lance. There's so many quarterbacks that end up busting out, and it's a very small percentage of quarterbacks that actually work out. For the Raiders, you might not say that, hey, we want to actually go down the route of drafting a quarterback. You got to find out if there's any sort of upside with Gardner Minshew, if there's any sort of upside with Desmond Ridder, if there's any sort of upside with Aiden O'Connell. And O'Connell's probably the guy that I'm most excited to see under a new offensive coordinator. You know, last year I felt like Aiden O'Connell looked a lot better than he looked this year. And I think this year the big issue was obviously Luke Getsy. In my opinion, I think Luke Getsy is one of the worst offensive coordinators in the NFL. And I would even make the argument that the Bears kind of have proven that point up to this point. Last year, Luke Getsy was with the Chicago Bears, or for the last 2 years, he was with the Chicago Bears. And they ended up firing nobody on that staff except for Luke Getsy. Luke Getsy's the only guy they ended up firing. They replaced him with Shane Waldron. And the Chicago Bears are 4-4 at this point. That's with a rookie quarterback. Right? So the Chicago Bears are a great example of a team telling us that, hey, this guy's not a good coach. And we can even look at the Raiders, right? Let's just be honest. Luke Getsy was not the Raiders' first choice at the offensive coordinator position. The Raiders obviously tried hiring a couple other guys, but there were rumors. They wanted to interview Clint Kubiak, and we're not 100% sure how that kind of went. They offered, obviously, Cliff Kingsbury the job, and, you know, we had that entire scenario happen. There's another report that's out there. Chip Kelly was another guy that the Raiders kind of wanted. He ended up going back to college, so there's rumors that the Raiders tried hiring multiple people before essentially hiring Luke Getsy. And, you know, I always go back to the offseason. You know, I talked about Luke Getsy multiple times, and I remember a lot of people were like, hey, give this guy an opportunity. Maybe he'll bounce back. But this entire season really relied on Luke Getsy, right? We had talked about this multiple times in the offseason. We talked about how if Luke Getsy's a good coach, the Raiders will have success. If Luke Getsy can be a top 10 offensive coordinator, if he can get this quarterback to play as a top 10 to 15 quarterback, the Raiders will have success, and none of that happened essentially, right? And the Raiders right now are 2-7 because of that offensive coordinator position. The Raiders are where they're at essentially because of what we've gotten out of Luke Getsy, and it's unfortunate because for the Raiders, you know, we go season by season, and the season's basically over because of the offensive coordinator that we hired. Another thing that I want to kind of see as we go forward is, you know, I want to see the center and right tackle. I want to see the quarterbacks in the new scheming system. I want to see which wide receivers can have success. You know, Tyreek McAllister was a guy that the Raiders released yesterday. And when that signing kind of happened where they signed a different guy, they released Tyreek McAllister, I was kind of surprised because McAllister looked so good in the preseason, and I thought to myself, how could that guy look so good in the preseason, come into the regular season and not have success? And then you could think about it. You know, Luke Getsy's the offensive coordinator. This guy doesn't know how to utilize his players. This guy does not know how to get his guys the football in space. And you know, this is kind of what you would expect. You know, guys like Tyreek McAllister that have upside would get cut. Right? Not saying he won't be brought back to the practice squad and those type of things. But the Raiders haven't been able to utilize some of their talents. Even a guy like Trey Tucker. Trey Tucker has so much upside coming into this year two. This guy's shown us a bunch of flashes. We're throwing this guy 50-50 jump balls, and that just doesn't make sense. You know, that comes down to the offensive coordinator. I talked about this in my video earlier. You know, one wide receiver runs an out route, the quarterback throws a curl, or the quarterback throws a back shoulder while the receiver thinks the ball's coming over the top. It's just the little things that have been off with Luke Getsy, and there's just no way you can not blame the offensive coordinator. And again, I will always come back to the fact that the Raiders hiring Luke Getsy was a big mistake, but at that point, you know, who else are the Raiders going to really hire? You know, they offered multiple people the job. Those guys did not want to take the job, and then they ultimately settled with Luke Getsy. And we'll see what we have with a guy like Scott Turner, right? Again, it's not confirmed that Scott Turner will take the job, but if Scott Turner does end up taking the job, we'll see what actually ends up happening as we go forward. You know, I saw someone that I really, really respect talk about Antonio Pierce a little bit. You know, not saying Antonio Pierce is a terrible head coach, but this guy did mention that there's a chance that because the Raiders hired Antonio Pierce, they weren't unable to land one of these, you know, high-quality offensive coordinators, right? Because these offensive coordinators also understand that if your head coach doesn't actually end up having success, if he's not a good head coach, that offensive coordinator is also going to be out of a job, essentially. We've seen certain guys, right? Like Eric Bieniemy's a great example of this. He took an offensive coordinator job with the Washington Commanders, and essentially he was there for like a year before the entire staff got fired, right? So although he didn't fill as an offensive coordinator, people are going to kind of look at that and say this guy wasn't that good because they obviously didn't have success. But it also goes down to the fact that the head coach wasn't that good of a head coach at that point. And unfortunately, some people think that with Antonio Pierce, some offensive coordinators are going to hesitate to go work for Antonio Pierce because job security wise, you know, long term, you might not be able to have that opportunity. And I'm not 100% sure if that's true. You know, I'm not 100% sold on Antonio Pierce. If you guys have watched this channel, you guys know that I'm a big Bobby Slowick fan. You know, and outside of Bobby Slowick, I'd also take a guy like Ben Johnson. There's a couple other guys as well, right? The Baltimore Ravens have a good offensive coordinator in Monken, who was with I believe he was with the Georgia Bulldogs like 2 years ago. He's a good offensive coordinator. You know, Bill Belichick's kind of available. We don't know if he's really going to coach or not. But there's good quality head coaches out there. And I would make the argument, you know, your quarterback does not matter as much without having a good head coach. You know, if you have Caleb Williams and you have a great head coach, you pair those two things together, you're going to be competing for the Super Bowl every single year. If you have Ben Johnson, right, he's going to elevate an offense every single year, no matter what. You can have Jared Goff, you can have Jimmy Garoppolo, as we had seen for multiple years with Kyle Shanahan. You can have pretty much any quarterback as long as you have a great play caller and you'll have success. And I think for the Raiders, that's what you got to hit on, right? And again, we saw kind of the negative aspects of that with having Luke Getsy on this roster. You know, Luke Getsy essentially lasted, 9 games for the Raiders. The Raiders brought this guy in thinking, hey, hopefully this guy's able to get the best out of Aiden O'Connell. Hopefully he's able to get the best out of Gardner Minshew. And we saw early in the preseason, you know, I always go back to that play against the Minnesota Vikings where it was a goal line situation. I forget who it was. It might have been Brock Bowers. He was supposed to run, I think, a corner route in the end zone or in the red zone. I think we're at like the 3-4 yard line. But essentially him and Trey Tucker like kind of run into each other. Both guys kind of stop around the same time. And Aiden O'Connell's looking that way. Neither of the guys run the same route. Then he tries running, and he ends up getting sacked by Dallas Turner. I always think about that moment right there. And I always think about the fact that the Raiders are never able to clean that aspect up, right? They're never able to turn it around. They're never able to find success. And I'm not surprised the Raiders are essentially where they're at, right? Because I always thought Luke Getsy was a bad offensive coordinator. And I always thought that this is kind of where things are headed for the Raiders, right? We're always going to head to the point where Luke Getsy's not a good coach. we're always going to head to the point where at some point the Raiders were going to fire this guy because he's just not going to have success, right? And I will continue to say this until I'm proven wrong. I know a lot of people disagree with me, and I know a lot of people disagreed with it earlier when I said it. The Raiders' quarterbacks are not the big issue, right? If you understand the game of football, you realize that play callers matter a lot more than the actual quarterback. Shane Steichen, the Indianapolis Colts head coach, last year won like 9 games with Gardner Minshew as his quarterback. If Gardner Minshew can win 9 games with that team wasn't the best team in the NFL. They're an average team, right? They're like a top 12 to 15 team roster-wise, right? And the Raiders aren't that far off that either. But Sean Steichen's a great offensive coordinator. You look at a guy like Rich Gannon, right? Gannon's had a lot of success as well, right? So there's guys out there, right? I don't think it's Rich Gannon. I forget his name, but there's a really, really good coach out there. There's a lot of coaches out there that have success, right? And to me, I think the Las Vegas Raiders got to find that coach, right? It's not your quarterback, because for the Raiders, you think about the quarterback situation. Gardner Minshew's come in and he's failed. Aiden O'Connell's come in, he's failed. Desmond Ritter's come in, and Ritter's only been here for 1 game essentially, but in the moments that matter, right? Not the garbage time drive that he scored at the end of the game. In every other drive he had, I think he had like 4 or 5 drives, he didn't do anything. And that comes down to the play calling. That comes down to the offensive coordinator, right? To me, the big issue with the Raiders has been Luke Getsy. It hasn't been the quarterbacks. And I think there's a real chance that as we go forward, our team will actually be better on the offensive side, right? Scott Turner is a much better play caller than Luke Getsy was. Now, I'm not sure if we can flip this season because of the fact that, Luke Getsy installed the offense. So a lot of the play calls, a lot of those things have already been installed by Luke Getsy. I'm not sure we can flip all those things, right? You're not going to be able to change those things as you go forward. Of course, you'll be able to fine tune some things. You'll be able to crack the thing here or there. So we'll see what he can actually do. But generally speaking, I don't know. We'll see what ends up happening, right? But the Raiders did fire Luke Getsy. I do think it was the right decision at this point, and we'll see what ends up happening as we kind of go forward. I am happy that Antonio Pierce has made the change, but truth be told, if the Raiders don't get better this season, Antonio Pierce probably shouldn't be here either, right? And I want to kind of wrap this video up with one final thing. I'm not saying that the Raiders are going to win the Super Bowl this year, but I would like to see the Raiders win some games. Right now there's multiple teams that have 4 wins that are basically in the wild card spot, right? If you guys go look at where the current seeding kind of is, the Raiders are only like 2 games outside the playoffs at this point. And again, I'm not saying I think the Raiders are going to win the Super Bowl this year, but if you win 4 or 5 games as the season kind of comes to an end, 8 games might get you into the playoffs this year. It's a weird year, right? Go look at the standings. You guys might actually agree with me on that. But I want to see the Raiders actually be able to be competitive as we go forward. I want to see this offense bounce back a little bit. We have a good center in Jackson Powers-Johnson. We have a good tackle. We have probably 2 guys that are really good weapons on the offensive side with a bunch of guys that are, potentially difference makers, but it depends on if the coach is able to utilize those guys. Trey Tucker's been underutilized. Tyreek McAllister's been underutilized at this point. We'll see if those guys can kind of get involved, and then Alexander Madison can continue to have success. Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers. Let's see what Scott Turner can do, or whoever ends up getting the job. I think it'll be Turner. Let's see what these guys can do, man. But either way, man, Luke Getsy's been officially fired. I'm really, really happy to hear that. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Thumbs up, subscribe. I want to just take a second to give a big shout out to the sponsor of this channel, because this content would not be possible without Underdog. If you guys have never utilized Underdog before, trust me, man, you guys are missing out. I don't do traditional fantasy sports that often. I did do 1 league this year, but generally speaking, I'm not really doing it anymore. And that's mostly because of Underdog. Underdog has this game that I really, really enjoy. It's called Pick'em. Essentially, you're going to go out there and just make picks that you think are going to be right. They'll have pretty much every pick you can think of for every player, and they have multiple categories as well. So an example would be, I think Aiden O'Connell is going to throw for 125 yards. And you're essentially just going to pick higher on that, right? I think he'll have more than 125 yards. You might say, hey, Dak Prescott's going to have at least 2 touchdowns. Pick higher on that. You might say Caleb Williams is going to have a rushing touchdown. And some of those stats also give you multipliers, right? So usually for quarterbacks rushing it in, right? That's something most quarterbacks aren't doing every single week.
you'll get like a 4x multiplier on that. So depending on the multiplier, depending on how many picks, you can turn $5 into $400, $1,000, right? Whatever it ends up being. Obviously, it depends on the multiplier, but Underdog to me is one of those places that I pretty much do every single week at this point. Very fun. It makes like watching the Jets and the Dolphins without Tua. It makes them interesting, right? So check out Underdog. If you guys have never used them before, it is the best place. Trust me when I say that. Go to underdogfantasy.com. Use my promo code that you guys see on the screen, or use the app. I recommend the app.